A black belt in jiu-jitsu challenges a black cleaning lady to a fight just for fun. And what happens next is something no one there will ever forget. The mop was still wet when Lauren Baker walked into the gym. It was early Tuesday morning, just past 6 o'clock. Camilla Turner had her back to the front door, wiping the right corner of the mat with that slow rhythm she had every morning. Methodical, almost meditative. The gym was silent, the kind of silence that belongs to people who arrive before the world wakes up. "Hey," Camilla didn't turn around right away. She finished the motion, leaned the mop handle against the wall, and looked over her shoulder. Lauren Baker was 26 years old, a black belt since she was 22, and had the bearing of someone who grew up hearing she was talented. Her white GA was immaculate, her belt tied with the precision of a ritual. Her hair was tied back without a single strand out of place. She wasn't cruel by nature. She was the kind of person who crosses certain boundaries without realizing they exist, which is sometimes more dangerous than conscious cruelty. "Do you clean here every day?" "Every day," Camilla replied. Her voice was low, without inflection. Lauren looked at the mat, then at Camilla, then at the mat again. There was something in the way she looked, not exactly contempt, but that distance certain people maintain without ever having consciously chosen to do so. "Have you ever tried training?" Camilla took the cord back. "No. We could do some light sparring." The smile was casual, natural, just for fun, just so you can feel what the mat is like. The gym was quiet. Outside, a car passed on the wet street. The ceiling still held the faint smell of sweat and rubber from the night before. Camilla looked at the spot on the mat that still needed cleaning and didn't answer. Lauren interpreted the silence as shy hesitation. She was used to that effect. She was a state champion, had trophies on the glass shelf right by the entrance, and people usually shrunk in her presence without quite knowing why. "I won't hurt you," she added. "I promise." That sentence hung in the air like smoke after the fire has gone out. Camilla picked up the bucket and walked toward the back hallway without answering. But before turning the corner, she stopped in front of a narrow door, the cleaning closet, and opened it to put away the equipment. On the inside of the door, held in place with a worn piece of tape, was a photo. Small, faded, with edges slightly curled by time and the hallway's humidity. No one at the gym knew what that photo was. Students walked down the hallway every day. They never paid attention. It wasn't the kind of thing that catches the eye of someone who isn't looking. But it was there. For months. Derek King arrived at 7:20. Owner for 12 years. A coral-colored black belt. The man who had transformed a 200 square meter, rented space into one of the most respected training centers in the state. He had a habit of arriving before the students, having coffee in the small back room, and looking at the clean tatami mat before the weight of the day began to bear down. When he saw Camilla sitting on the bench by the aisle, her uniform still on, and her hands folded in her lap, he knew immediately that something had happened. She didn't usually sit down. Camilla Turner was the type who disappeared when her shift ended. Quiet, efficient, invisible by choice. Seeing her standing there motionless was the kind of thing that didn't fit into any normal version of the day. "What's up?" Derek asked, lowering his voice without realizing it. She told him, briefly, without drama. Lauren's proposal, the exact words, the tone in which they were spoken. Derek was silent for a time that was far too long for the situation. It wasn't the pause of someone processing something simple. It was the pause of someone calculating, weighing variables Camilla hadn't mentioned. But that clearly existed in his head, in some drawer he'd kept locked for quite some time. "Did you say anything to her?" "No." He nodded slowly. He ran his hand through the back of his neck. He looked down the hallway as if checking to see if anyone might have heard. "Well, never mind." but his voice lacked the lightness the words demanded. There was a very specific tension there. The tension of someone carrying a secret they didn't ask to keep, but took on anyway because someone important asked them to, and who now realized with growing discomfort that this agreement had an expiration date that was fast approaching. Camilla looked at him for a second. Just one. Then she grabbed her bag, said thank you in her usual voice, and left. Derek stood still in the hallway after she left. He stared at the closed door of the cleaning closet for a long moment. Then he went to get his coffee and couldn't finish the cup. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel before continuing, because what comes next will completely change what you think you know about Camilla Turner. The story began to spread throughout the gym that same Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't Lauren who told it on purpose. It was the way she mentioned it in passing, during a break between rounds, with that tone of someone sharing a small, harmless anecdote. I told the cleaning lady to train with me this morning. She didn't even respond. A short laugh, another laugh. The story spread from student to student with the specific speed of things that seem harmless, precisely because no one stops to examine what lies beneath. Lauren didn't mean any harm. That was the problem. She genuinely thought she was being nice, including someone, offering an experience. The fact that the offer carried a weight she couldn't see because she'd never had to see it. That detail didn't appear on the maps Lauren Baker navigated. When you grow up being seen, it's hard to grasp what it means not to be. By Wednesday night, the situation had already become a sort of running joke in the gym's group chat. Nothing explicitly cruel. Just that specific kind of humor that works at the expense of whoever isn't in the room to respond. Derek read every message without commenting. He closed his phone. He stared at the ceiling of the back room for quite a while, as if trying to calculate how far this would go before he needed to do something. Thursday morning, Camilla arrived at 5:50 as usual. Felix Parker was at the gym earlier than usual. 42 years old, a brown belt for 3 years, one of the academy's longest-standing students, and probably the quietest. He had the kind of presence that fades into the background of conversations. People rarely remembered whether he was in the room or not. Years of training had developed in him a quality of attention that was almost clinical. He noticed things. He rarely commented. That morning, he was doing technical drills alone in the corner of the mat when Camilla walked in with the bucket and mop. He greeted her with a nod. She responded in kind. Neither of them said anything else. Felix didn't return to training immediately. He stood watching, not conspicuously. The kind of peripheral attention one develops after years in a gym, when the body learns to catalog movement even when the mind is seemingly elsewhere. Camilla was running the mop along the edge of the mat, and there was something about the way she held the handle, her hands, the position of her elbows, the balance of her weight on her hips as she turned her body to cover a wider area without unnecessary steps. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, the kind of detail that only makes sense if you know exactly what you're looking for. Felix stayed quiet for a long time after that. When Camilla walked toward the back hallway, he returned to practice without saying a word to anyone. But around 8 in the morning, when 2 younger students started commenting on the situation in their usual tone, Felix said just one thing. Without looking up from the tape he was wrapping around his wrist, "There's something about that woman." The 2 laughed. They thought he was being dramatic. Felix said nothing more, and he didn't laugh. On Friday, Lauren stepped in. Not out of malice, but because of the way certain situations take on a life of their own when no one puts the brakes on. She mentioned Camilla again in the hallway before the afternoon practice with 3 other students nearby. The sparring proposal had taken on a different tone without Lauren realizing it. What had started as a casual invitation had gained an audience, and an audience changes the nature of anything. "Whenever you want," Lauren said, smiling. "We have an extra kimono here." Camilla was holding the bucket in her right hand. She looked at Lauren. She looked at the three students around her. She looked back at Lauren. There was a silence of maybe 4 seconds, which in that hallway seemed substantially longer. Camilla said. A single sentence, low voice, no inflection. Lauren blinked. So did the three around her. No one had expected that response. Derek, who was 6 meters away and had heard everything, felt something turn inside his chest. Not exactly fear, but something more complicated. The sensation of someone who tried to hold a kettle over the fire and realized too late that the water was already boiling. It was set for Monday, 6:30 a.m., before the students arrived, or so Lauren imagined. On Saturday, Camilla entered the empty gym for the weekend cleaning. She walked down the back hallway, opened the cleaning closet, and put away the supplies from the previous day. Before closing the door, she stood still for a moment, looking at the photo on the inside wall. It wasn't sadness on her face. It wasn't pride. It was something harder to name. The expression of someone looking at a version of herself that truly existed in another time and that hadn't disappeared, only been stored away in a restricted access place, that sometimes, alone in a silent hallway early in the morning, she allowed to breathe for an instant. She closed the door and went to work. Monday arrived with a gray sky and the gym more crowded than that time of morning had any reason to be. The word had gotten around, not in an announced way. More like those things everyone knows without anyone needing to say it explicitly. There were 6 students sitting in chairs along the wall when Camilla arrived. 7, counting Felix Parker, who was leaning against the column on the opposite side with his arms crossed, and an expression that was neither amused nor expectant. It was one of attention, the specific attention of someone who has already formed a hypothesis and is waiting to see if they were right. Lauren was already on the mat, white kimono, black belt, stretching her shoulders with the ease of someone who is absolutely certain of the situation. Camilla stopped at the entrance. She looked at the people against the wall. She looked at the mat. She looked at Derek, who was in the back with a cup of coffee that looked more like an object to hold than an actual drink. He looked back at her. There was a plea in his expression. Not for her to stop. Not exactly for her to continue. Just the silent plea of someone holding their breath and already knowing they have no control over what's coming. Camilla went to the cleaning closet. She returned wearing dark blue shorts and a plain white t-shirt. No kimono. No belt. Bare feet on the tatami. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, her posture upright yet relaxed, like someone who had entered a familiar room. One of the students against the wall whispered something to the classmate next to him. There was a brief laugh that died out when no one joined in. Lauren approached with her usual smile. She explained the fundamentals of the guard position. She showed how to close the grip on the kimono. She was didactic, patient, the demeanor of someone teaching, which was simultaneously the demeanor of someone who needs the other person to understand that she has something to teach. She was being kind, and in that specific kindness lay a hierarchy she didn't even realize she was drawing. Camilla listened. She didn't ask questions. She didn't try out the demonstrated movements. She just listened, her eyes slightly lowered, her hands still loose. You can start whenever you want, Lauren said finally. Camilla closed her eyes. 3 breaths. Slow, controlled. It wasn't a relaxation technique. It was preparation. The gesture of someone accessing something that has existed for many years in a very specific part of the body, not in the mind. Not in intention, but in the muscle memory that doesn't fade even when everything else does. When she opened her eyes, there was a smile on her face. It wasn't nervousness, it wasn't irony. It was the smile of someone who had just arrived at a place they know well. On the opposite side of the room, Felix Parker slowly straightened up. What happened in the next 90 seconds was hard to describe for those in the room at that moment. Not because it was violent, but because it was too precise for the context in which it was set. There was a geometry to it, a fluidity that didn't require force because it didn't need it. It was the kind of movement that only exists when someone has spent enough time in an art to stop fighting against it and start inhabiting it. In 12 seconds, Lauren was in a position she didn't recognize. She tried to get out, and the space that should have existed to get out simply didn't exist, not because she was being blocked by force, because it had been occupied beforehand, in a way Lauren couldn't trace because the path hadn't been aggressive. It had been fluid, almost gentle, the sequence of someone who understands the geometry of the human body in a way that goes beyond effort. In 30 seconds, Lauren was processing how she had gotten there. In 90, she hit the mat. The silence that followed was of a different quality than ordinary silence. It was the silence of an entire room recalibrating, reviewing, from back to front, every premise she had brought into that space that morning. Lauren stood still for a moment, resting on her elbows, staring at the mat. Then she looked up, at Camilla, who was standing, her breathing perfectly normal, the smile already gone. In its place, only that calm, hard-to-name expression she had when she closed the cleaning closet door. "How did you—" Lauren began. She didn't finish. One of the students against the wall whispered. "What was that?" Felix Parker replied, still leaning against the column without looking at anyone in particular. "That was real jujitsu." Derek set his coffee cup down on the floor. He stared at Camilla for 3 seconds. She had already turned her back and was walking toward the back hallway. He knew at that moment that if he didn't do something, she would grab her clothes, change in silence, and walk out the door as if the last 90 seconds had been part of the usual routine, as if nothing more than that were necessary. And there was something very wrong with that possibility. "Camilla." She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. "Can you stay a second?" There were 6 people in the room, all of them watching. The weight of those gazes was tangible, almost physical. Camilla turned. She crossed her arms. She waited, with the specific patience of someone who had learned, over many years, to let the world sort itself out before reacting. Derek took a deep breath. He wasn't the type of man to make speeches. But there were things that room needed to understand, not for him, not for Lauren, not for the narrative that had formed over the past week, but because there was a specific injustice in letting people leave there with the wrong story in their heads. "Her name is Camilla Turner," he began. Calm voice, direct. She was a world grappling champion, 3 times, undefeated in competition for 6 consecutive years, 8 international medals, 2 world titles in the open division. No one in the room made a sound. "She works here early in the morning because it was the only job with the right hours she could find when she came back. She was away from the sport for 18 months. Not because she lost, not because she got hurt." Derek paused, briefly, necessarily. Her daughter got sick. Seriously, the kind of illness that takes up every hour you have, every decision you make, every morning you wake up. Camilla spent those 18 months shuttling between the hospital, the doctor's office, health insurance forms, and sleepless nights waiting for test results. She didn't abandon the sport. She chose her daughter, and when the situation stabilized and she needed a job, I needed someone to clean early. He looked at Camilla for a moment before continuing. "She specifically asked me not to tell anyone. I respected that request. Maybe I should have said something before we got here." The silence that followed was different from the silence after sparring. That one had been one of surprise. This one was heavy. The specific weight of a room full of people reevaluating what they'd done and said over the past week. Lauren's eyes were fixed on the mat. Later, after the other students had gradually left, Derek went to the back hallway. He stopped in front of the cleaning closet for a moment, that narrow door everyone walked past without looking. He opened it slowly. The photo was still there. Curled edges. A slightly faded image, but visible enough for anyone looking closely. It was a podium photo. Camilla with her arm raised, the medal around her neck, looking straight at the camera with that expression he recognized. Not one of exuberant triumph, but of something deeper than that. Of arrival, the expression of someone who had traveled a long road and arrived where she needed to be. And in her arms, a girl of perhaps 7 years old, hugging her mother's neck, wrapped in a flag that almost covered her face. The girl was laughing. It was the kind of photo that needs no caption. You look at it and understand the cost, the value, what remained, what was at stake, all at once. Derek closed the locker door carefully. Lauren stayed at the gym until 10 in the morning. After the others left, she sat on the edge of the mat staring at her own hands. Felix Parker walked by before leaving. He stopped for a second beside her. "Those hands of hers," he said slowly. "I saw them Thursday morning when she came in to clean. The way she held the mop handle." He paused. "You could tell they weren't the hands of someone who'd never trained. But that's not what matters." Lauren looked at him. "What matters," Felix continued, "is that you never asked who she was. You only saw what she was doing." He left. The gym fell silent. Lauren stood there for a long time, with that sentence settling inside her the way certain truths settle. Slowly, without haste, without asking permission, like water finding the lowest available level. 2 weeks later, life at the gym had returned to normal on the surface. Workouts followed the usual schedule. Students arrived, trained, and left. The trophies remained on the glass shelf near the entrance. The mat was cleaned every morning before 7. But some things had changed in ways that aren't visible when viewed from a distance. Lauren Baker started arriving earlier. Not to train, at least not at first. She'd arrive around 6:10, 15 minutes after Camilla, and stay in the small back room with a cup of coffee. She didn't force conversation. She didn't try to fix what had happened with words, because she had realized, during those hours alone on the mat, that certain things cannot be fixed with words, if they are fixed at all, through presence and sustained attention over time, through the willingness to show up even when it's not convenient. So she showed up. In the second week, one morning when the two were in the same hallway at the same time, Lauren asked about her daughter. It wasn't an elaborate question. It wasn't a grand gesture preceded by apologies and explanations. It was a simple question, asked in passing, with the tone of someone who genuinely wants to know. Camilla looked at her for a second, the look of someone assessing the sincerity of a question before deciding what to do with it. "Better," Camilla said. "She went back to school in March." "That's good," Lauren replied. And it was true. There was nothing more to those two. Words. No guilt disguised as concern. No performative generosity. Just what the words said. Camilla nodded. Lauren nodded. The two went on their way. Derek King saw that exchange at the end of the hallway and said nothing. There was one thing he knew about that gym, about any real gym, that took him years to fully understand. The mat is democratic in a way the outside world rarely manages to be. On it, what you can do is who you are. Not your title, not your appearance, not the story people construct about you before they meet you. The movement, the technique, the honesty the body produces when it has nowhere left to hide behind pretense. Camilla Turner knew this better than anyone in that space. It was probably the reason she had asked that no one know her story. Not because she was ashamed, but because she knew that if people knew, they would see the story before they saw her. And she didn't want to be a story. She wanted to be a person. Now the two things had finally come together. One March morning, with the sun streaming in sideways through the gym's tall windows, Camilla arrived at the cleaning closet as usual. She opened the door. She grabbed the mop, the bucket, the rag, and then she stood still for a moment in front of the photo on the inside wall. The same photo as always. The same curled edges, the same faded image. The girl laughing on her mother's shoulders wrapped in the flag, on the podium of a championship that had taken place in another life. Not because that life had ended, but because it had matured into something harder and more real than any trophy. Camilla took the photo off the wall. She didn't throw it away. She folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her lab coat. She closed the locker door and went to clean the mat. Outside, Lauren Baker was arriving. She saw Camilla through the glass of the front door and before entering held the door open. That small gesture. Automatic. The kind of thing that on most days means absolutely nothing. An open door. A second of attention. A gesture the body makes without the mind having to decide. On that day, in that context, after everything that had happened within those walls, it meant everything. Camilla walked through the door. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Some conversations happen without words. Some are made entirely of small gestures and presence, of showing up, of holding the door open for someone who was there all along, and whom you only stopped to see too late. But stopped. This story doesn't end with a trophy. It doesn't end with a speech or a dramatic reconciliation. It ends with an open door and two women in a gym early in the morning, on an ordinary day, with the light coming in from the side and the mat waiting. Sometimes dignity doesn't need a stage. It just needs space, and someone who finally stops long enough to see what was there from day one. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this waiting for you. Stories about people the world insisted on not seeing until it became impossible to ignore.